At exactly 7:40 in the evening on the 27th of October 2025, a piece of legislation received Royal Assent that property experts are calling the biggest shake-up to rental housing in nearly 40 years. The Renters' Rights Act 2025 is now law, and whilst politicians are celebrating it as a victory for tenants, something rather strange is happening across London. Landlords are listing their properties for sale in record numbers, not because they want to, but because they've done the maths and realised they simply can't afford to stay in the game anymore. This law was meant to protect renters from unfair evictions and dodgy landlords. Noble intentions, absolutely. But here's the uncomfortable truth nobody in Westminster wants to admit. It's making the rental crisis catastrophically worse. The Renters' Rights Act 2025 has been years in the making. It was promised by the Conservatives, shelved, resurrected by Labour, and finally pushed through Parliament with overwhelming support from MPs who genuinely believed they were fixing a broken system. And on paper, it does sound impressive. This is the most significant reform to the private rental sector since the Housing Act 1988, affecting roughly 11 million private renters across England. The changes are sweeping, and for tenants who've dealt with rogue landlords or lived in fear of sudden eviction, many of these protections sound like exactly what's needed. So what's actually in this law? The headline change is the abolition of Section 21, the so-called no-fault eviction rule that's allowed landlords to end tenancies with just 2 months' notice and no reason given. That's gone. From the moment the law comes fully into force, every tenancy in England will become periodic, meaning rolling monthly contracts with no fixed end date. Landlords will only be able to evict tenants for specific reasons like rent arrears, antisocial behaviour, or if they genuinely need to move back into the property themselves or sell it. And even then, they'll need to give 4 months' notice, double the previous requirement. Rent increases will be capped at once per year, and tenants will have the right to challenge unfair hikes through a tribunal. Landlords won't be able to refuse pets without a reasonable excuse, and there's a 12-month protection period during which tenants can't be evicted for the landlord wanting to sell or move in. On top of that, every landlord in England will need to register on a mandatory national database, and a new ombudsman service will handle disputes. It's comprehensive, it's ambitious, and it sounds brilliant if you're a renter who's been shafted by a dodgy landlord. But here's where it gets messy. The law received Royal Assent on the 27th of October, but it's not all coming into force at once. The government is rolling it out in stages, and the big changes, the ones everyone's talking about, won't actually kick in until what's being called a Big Bang commencement date, likely sometime in spring or summer 2026. Some initial provisions will start on the 27th of December this year, mainly giving local councils stronger enforcement powers to crack down on criminal landlords. But the abolition of Section 21, the extended notice periods, the rental caps, those are still months away. And that delay is crucial because it's giving landlords a window to get out before the new rules trap them in unprofitable investments they can't escape from. Sounds like great news for renters though, right? Stronger protections, longer notice periods, limits on rent increases, the end of arbitrary evictions. What's not to love? Well, here's the problem. The law assumes that landlords will simply absorb the costs, comply with the new rules, and carry on renting out properties as normal. But that's not what's happening. Not even close. In fact, landlords are fleeing the market so fast it's genuinely alarming, and the data backs it up in a way that's impossible to ignore. A survey conducted earlier this year found that 67% of landlords across the UK are planning to either exit the rental market entirely or significantly reduce the number of properties they own in 2025. 2/3. That's not a small minority of disgruntled investors. That's a mass exodus. And London is even worse. In the capital, 42% of landlords say they're planning to leave the market altogether. Not reduce, leave completely. When you ask them why, the answers are consistent. 88% cite the Renters' Rights Bill as a major concern. 75% specifically mention the end of Section 21 as a deal-breaker. 70% say the rental market is simply no longer profitable enough to justify the hassle and risk. And here's the kicker, 90% of London landlords, 9 out of 10, say they have no confidence whatsoever in the future of the rental sector. Only 2% are planning to expand their portfolios. 2%. Everyone else is either holding steady out of necessity or actively trying to get out. The evidence is showing up in the property market itself. Nationwide, 15.6% of homes currently listed for sale are former rental properties. A year ago, that figure was 9.8%. It's jumped by nearly 60% in 12 months. Knight Frank reported a 10% drop in new rental listings in London during the first quarter of 2025 alone, and rental supply is down 15% compared to 2023. These aren't projections or predictions. This is happening right now, in real time, and the law hasn't even fully kicked in yet. The very legislation designed to protect tenants is directly causing the supply of rental properties to vanish. And when supply shrinks whilst demand stays high or increases, there's only one possible outcome. Rents go up, competition gets fiercer, and the people the law was meant to help end up worse off than before. It's not just fear or speculation driving landlords out either. The financial reality of being a landlord in London in 2025 is genuinely brutal, and for many, it simply doesn't make sense anymore. Let's talk numbers. Rental yields in London, the annual return landlords get from rent after costs, have collapsed to between 3 and 4%. Compare that to Manchester, Birmingham or Liverpool, where yields are still sitting at 7 to 8%. And you can see why London landlords are looking at their spreadsheets and deciding it's not worth it. But it's not just about yields. The cost of borrowing has exploded. Back in January 2022, the Bank of England base rate was 0.25%. Today, it's 5%. If you've got a mortgage on a rental property, and most landlords do, your monthly interest payments have roughly tripled in less than 4 years. A mortgage that cost £300 a month in early 2022 is now costing £640 or more. That's an extra £4,000 a year just in interest, and rental income hasn't kept pace. Then there's the policy environment, which has been getting steadily more hostile for over a decade. The Section 24 tax changes, rolled out between 2017 and 2020, removed mortgage interest relief for landlords. That meant they could no longer deduct mortgage interest from their rental income before calculating tax. For higher-rate taxpayers, that change alone wiped out profitability for many. In 2016, the government introduced a 3% stamp duty surcharge on second properties, making it more expensive to buy rental properties in the first place. Post-Grenfell fire safety regulations have forced landlords in certain buildings to contribute tens of thousands of pounds toward cladding removal and building safety upgrades. And from 2028, every rental property will need to meet a minimum energy performance certificate rating of C. For older properties, and London is full of them, that means new boilers, insulation, double glazing, rewiring, sometimes major structural work. The estimates vary, but most experts put the cost somewhere between £10,000 and £25,000 per property. For a landlord with 2 or 3 flats, that's a bill of 30 to 75 grand just to stay compliant. On top of all that, general repair and maintenance costs have shot up thanks to inflation. 80% of landlords say repair costs are the single biggest financial pressure they're facing, and tradespeople aren't getting any cheaper. Plumbers, electricians, builders, they've all raised their rates significantly over the past few years, and landlords are absorbing those costs whilst being told they can only increase rent once a year. So you've got higher mortgage costs, higher repair costs, higher compliance costs, and now a law that removes your ability to quickly regain possession of your property if things go wrong. Many landlords are now losing money every month, even with tenants in place and rent being paid on time. It's unsustainable, and they know it. And then there's Awaab's law, a provision within the Renters' Rights Act that's named after a tragedy and designed with the best intentions. But in practice, it's absolutely terrifying landlords. Awaab Ishak was a 2-year-old boy who died in 2020 from prolonged exposure to mold in his family's social housing flat in Rochdale. His death was entirely preventable, and it sparked outrage across the country. Awaab's law, which came into force on the 27th of October 2025 for social housing, sets strict timeframes for landlords to investigate and fix hazards like damp and mold. Emergency repairs, things like total loss of heating in winter or no running water, must be dealt with within 24 hours. damp and mold complaints must be investigated within 10 working days. Once investigated, landlords have 5 days to make the property safe, and they must provide written findings to the tenant within 3 working days after that. The law currently applies to social housing, but it's going to be extended to private rentals as part of the Renters' Rights Act rollout, likely sometime in 2026 or 2027. And whilst nobody disagrees that tenants deserve safe, habitable homes, the practical reality of meeting these deadlines is causing genuine panic among landlords, especially those with older properties. London is full of Victorian and Edwardian houses and flats, many of which have inherent damp issues due to their age, construction, and lack of modern damp proofing. Fixing these problems properly often requires specialist contractors, structural surveys, and significant building work. Getting a contractor out within 24 hours or even 10 days during the winter when everyone's boiler is breaking and damp complaints are through the roof is often impossible. The costs can run into the thousands per property, and if you fail to comply, you're looking at court action, compensation claims, legal fees, potential fines, and loss of rental income whilst the property sits empty or deemed uninhabitable. For small landlords, and 45% of landlords in the UK only own one rental property, these kinds of costs and risks are simply unmanageable. They don't have the cash reserves or the scale to absorb unexpected bills or navigate complex legal processes. They're ordinary people who bought a second property as an investment or kept their old home when they moved, and now they're being told they need to operate like professional housing associations with 24/7 repair teams and legal departments. They can't, so they're selling, and the properties they're selling aren't being bought by other landlords. They're being bought by owner-occupiers or investors who'll sit on them, which means they're leaving the rental market entirely. The law isn't even fully in force yet, but landlords aren't waiting around to see how bad it gets. They're selling now, whilst they still can, because once Section 21 is abolished, getting rid of a tenant, even a problematic one, becomes significantly harder and more expensive. Right now, if you've got a tenant who's consistently late with rent, but not quite in formal arrears, or who's causing minor issues that don't rise to the level of antisocial behaviour, you can serve a Section 21 notice and regain possession within 2 months. It's not pleasant, but it's straightforward. Once the new law kicks in, you'll need to go to court for every eviction, prove specific grounds, wait months for a hearing, and hope the judge agrees with you. The county courts are already massively backlogged, and the Law Society has openly warned that the system isn't ready for the flood of cases that's coming. Evictions that used to take 2 to 3 months could easily take 6 to 9, and during that time, you're still responsible for the mortgage, the bills, the maintenance, everything, whilst receiving no rent if the tenant stopped paying. There's a time-limited window here that's crucial. The government is implementing the law in stages, and there's a mechanism where Section 21 notices served before the commencement date will still be honoured under the old rules. Industry bodies pushed for at least 6 months' notice before the Big Bang date to give landlords time to prepare, but the government hasn't confirmed that yet. So landlords are rushing to serve notices now, whilst they still can, and get their properties sold before the new system traps them. A spare room survey from February 2025 found that 34% of landlords were planning to leave the market altogether, and 29% were planning to reduce the number of properties they owned. Only 4.5% were planning to expand. Since the pandemic, rental stock in London has dropped by 41%, according to a joint report by Savills and the London School of Economics. That's nearly half the rental supply gone in less than 5 years, and it's happening at exactly the moment when demand is the highest it's been in decades. Renters are already paying the price, and it's only going to get worse. Rightmove and Zoopla, the 2 biggest property portals in the UK, are both predicting that London rents will rise by another 3 to 4% over the next 12 months. That's on top of the fact that rents are already 40% higher than they were before the pandemic. Demand is currently 30% above pre-pandemic levels, and the ratio of renters to available properties has climbed to 5 renters for every 1 property listed, up from 4.6 to 1 earlier this year. In the first quarter of 2025 alone, central London rents rose by 0.6%, the highest quarterly increase since November 2023. And this is all happening whilst landlords are leaving and supply is shrinking. It's a perfect storm. Now, supporters of the Renters' Rights Act will point to the growth of build-to-rent developments as the solution. These are purpose-built rental blocks owned and managed by institutional investors like pension funds and real estate companies. There are currently around 250,000 build-to-rent homes across the UK, and the government is encouraging more. But here's the problem. Over 400,000 private rental properties have disappeared from the market in the past few years. Even with institutional investment, there's a net loss of over 150,000 rental homes, and build-to-rent developments aren't filling the gap fast enough. In fact, build-to-rent starts are down 45% year-on-year. Developers are pausing projects because the economics don't work anymore. Rents aren't high enough to justify the construction costs, and planning permissions are harder to get. The pipeline is slowing down just when it needs to be accelerating. So who does this law actually help? The intentions were good, genuinely. Nobody wants to see families evicted with 2 months' notice for no reason. Nobody thinks tenants should live in damp, mouldy flats with landlords who ignore their complaints. The principles behind the Renters' Rights Act are sound, but good intentions don't pay rent, and they don't create housing supply. The law assumes a world where landlords are wealthy, exploitative, and able to absorb costs without flinching. But the reality is that most landlords are ordinary people with 1 or 2 properties operating on tight margins, and now facing a regulatory environment that makes the entire venture financially unviable. They're not villains, they're just people trying to make an investment work, and when it stops working, they leave. And when they leave, the rental supply vanishes, competition increases, rents go up, and the very people the law was designed to protect, working families, young professionals, key workers, end up significantly worse off. Landlords are stressed, tenants are suffering, and nobody's winning. The government keeps promising that help is on the way, that there'll be a comprehensive communications campaign, that full guidance will be issued, that local councils will be given the resources they need to enforce the new rules properly. But none of that creates more homes. It doesn't bring landlords back into the market. It doesn't make the maths work for small investors, and it certainly doesn't help the single mum in Hackney competing with 50 other applicants for a 2-bedroom flat she can barely afford. So what happens next? The government hasn't confirmed the exact date when the major provisions will come into force, but spring or summer 2026 seems most likely for the abolition of Section 21 and the introduction of the other big changes. Awaab's law for private rentals is still to be determined, with consultations ongoing about how the specific timeframes will apply outside of social housing. The county courts are already creaking under the weight of existing cases, and the influx of eviction disputes that'll come when everything has to go through the legal system is going to make things even slower and more expensive. The private rented sector ombudsman, another new layer of bureaucracy and cost for landlords, is coming soon. And the Decent Homes Standard, which will set minimum quality requirements for rental properties, won't even reach the private sector until the 2030s, possibly as late as 2035. Each new requirement, each new regulation, each additional cost or restriction will push more landlords toward the exit door. The Renters' Rights Act 2025 is now law. It passed just 6 days ago with the stated aim of protecting 11 million renters from unfair evictions, poor conditions, and exploitative practices. And in a perfect world, it would work exactly as intended. Tenants would have security, landlords would comply, and the market would adjust smoothly. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where 2/3 of landlords are planning to leave or shrink their portfolios, where supply is vanishing at exactly the moment demand is highest, where rents are climbing by 3 to 4% a year despite house prices falling, and where the people most in need of affordable, stable housing are being priced out faster than ever before. Small landlords, the ones with 1 or 2 properties and tight margins, can't absorb the costs and risks this law brings. They're selling up, often to owner-occupiers or investors who won't rent the properties out, which means those homes are leaving the rental market permanently. Institutional investors are supposed to fill the gap, but they're not building fast enough, and many are pausing projects because the returns don't justify the investment anymore. The rental market London desperately needs one with enough supply to meet demand and keep rents affordable, doesn't exist anymore. And this law, however well-intentioned, has just buried it even deeper. When will politicians learn that removing supply doesn't help renters, it destroys them? The answer, unfortunately, seems to be not yet.